Some men build a home to keep a family in. Elias Thorne had built his to hold a silence. It was a good silence, an orderly one, carved from the vast, humming quiet of the prairie and framed in sturdy pine. But a silence, all the same. This house knew the sound of one man's boots on the floorboards, the scrape of one chair pulled from the table, the solitary clink of a fork against a plate. It was a quiet that had settled into the grain of the wood, a loneliness so profound it had become a kind of peace. He had learned its rhythms, its weight. He knew the precise moment in the late afternoon when the sun would strike the west-facing window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in a single golden column. He knew the groan of the porch swing in the wind and the whisper of the dry grass against the foundation. These were the only voices in his life, and he had long ago stopped expecting any others. His desire for belonging was a buried thing, a seed planted in hard, dry earth so long ago he'd forgotten it was there. All that remained was the code he lived by: work hard, be decent, and do no harm. It was a simple creed for a simple life. He protected his land, his animals, and his solitude with a competence that left little room for error or emotion. Each morning began the same. The grind of coffee beans just enough for one, the splash of water in the basin, the careful check of the rifle on its pegs by the door, not for a threat he expected, but for the one he must always be ready for. It was a habit, like breathing. Today, the routine carried him into the small, dusty town of Providence for supplies. The air was thick with the heat of late summer, the kind that baked the ground and made the sky seem pale and washed out. He guided the wagon down the main street, his gaze sweeping the storefronts, the familiar faces. His attention was not on the gossip or the greetings, but on the spaces between things, the subtle shifts in the town's atmosphere. He felt it before he saw it, a knot of tension outside the mercantile. A crowd gathered where one shouldn't be. Men stood with their hands in their pockets, their expressions a grim mix of curiosity and shame. In their center stood Silas Croft, a man whose entitlement oiled his every movement. And beside him, on a small wooden crate, as if she were a bolt of cloth for auction, stood a woman. She was holding a baby. Elias reined in his horses, the leather creaking in the sudden stillness of his world. He didn't hear the murmur of the crowd, or Croft's oily pronouncements about an indenture left unpaid. He saw only her. She stood ramrod straight, her pride a brittle shield against the dozens of staring eyes. Her dress was worn, the fabric thin to near transparency at the elbows, but it was clean. Her hands, wrapped securely around the swaddled infant in her arms, were steady. It was her eyes that held him. They were not pleading or broken. They were a clear, cool gray, and they swept over the faces in the crowd with a defiant sort of judgment, missing nothing. She was a survivor. He knew it instantly. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she positioned her body to shield the child. She was cataloging her surroundings not for a rescuer, but for an escape route. His own protective instinct, a thing usually reserved for a lost calf or a weak fence post, rose in him with a force that was sharp and unfamiliar. Croft was holding up a piece of paper, a 5-year contract. Strong back, quiet mouth. The babe is a quiet one, too. A bargain for any man needing a housekeeper. The words were a desecration. Elias felt a cold, clean anger settle in his gut. This was not a transaction of labor. It was a public stripping of dignity. He watched as a few men shuffled, considering. He saw the flicker of fear, the first he'd seen in her eyes. It was not for herself, but for the child. That was what decided it. He swung down from the wagon, his movements deliberate, drawing eyes. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at Croft. "I'll take the contract," he said. His voice was level, quiet, but it cut through the murmuring. Croft grinned, smelling coin. Thorne. A man who knows value. Elias pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt. He didn't haggle. He counted out the full, exorbitant amount Croft had paid for the debt, the coins making a heavy, final sound in the man's palm. He took the paper from Croft's hand without touching his skin. The business was done. He turned to the woman. For the first time, their eyes met directly. He saw resilience, yes, but beneath it, a deep, weary caution. He didn't offer a hand to help her down. He simply gestured to his wagon, an offer, not a command. "Ma'am," he said, the word feeling strange in his quiet life. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent assessment that felt more thorough than any interview. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she stepped down from the crate. She did not wait for his help. She walked to the wagon, and with practiced ease, settled herself and the baby on the bench, her back as straight as before. He had bought a piece of paper. He had not, he knew with absolute certainty, bought her. Lena felt the wagon lurch into motion, the rattle of the wheels a jarring rhythm against the frantic beating of her own heart. She kept her eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead, her son Leo, a warm, solid weight in her arms. She did not look at the man beside her. She listened to the steady jingle of the harness, the soft snort of the horses, the quiet, even breaths he took. He did not speak. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every mile that pulled them farther from town, deeper into the vast, sun-bleached landscape. She had been preparing herself for the worst since the moment his shadow fell over her. She knew men like Croft, who saw weakness as an invitation. She did not know men like this one. He was stoic, his face a landscape of plains and angles, weathered by sun and solitude. His hands on the reins were large and competent, calloused but clean. He drove with an easy, focused calm. There was no triumph in his posture, no hint of the ownership he had just purchased. He simply drove the wagon, as if he were hauling sacks of flour. Fear was a familiar companion, but this uncertainty was a different kind of torment. She braced herself for the turnoff toward a rough-hewn bunkhouse or a dilapidated shed. Instead, he guided the horses toward a proper house, neat and solid, with a clean-swept porch and glass in the windows. It was the kind of home she hadn't let herself dream of in a very long time. He brought the wagon to a stop and was on the ground before she could move, but he didn't come to her side. He went to the horses, murmuring to them as he began to unhitch the traces. It was a gesture of routine, of normalcy, that was so at odds with her reality it left her momentarily speechless. She slid down from the bench, her legs unsteady. Leo stirred, his small mouth working in his sleep. The man Thorne, Croft had called him, finished with the horses and turned to her. He gestured toward the front door. "This way." His voice was low, a rumble of gravel. Inside, the house was spare but immaculate. A large main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a long counter for cooking. The air smelled of wood smoke and clean linen. He led her past the main room, down a short hall, to a closed door. He opened it, revealing a small bedroom. It held a simple bed with a patched quilt, a small table, and a window that looked out over the rolling fields. It was a room, not a cell. "This is yours," he said. He didn't look at her, but at the room itself, as if checking it for comfort. He led her back to the main room. The indenture contract was still in his hand. He laid it flat on the kitchen table. Then he placed a small tin of matches beside it. He finally met her eyes, and his gaze was direct, serious. "That paper is a contract between you and Silas Croft," he said, his words measured. "It is not a contract with me. You are not my property. You are a guest in my home." He pushed the matches a little closer to the paper. "We can burn it now, if you like. You are free to leave whenever you wish, or you're free to stay, for as long as you need." Lena stared at him, then at the paper that represented her bondage, and at the matches that represented her freedom. It was a choice. He was giving her a choice. Her throat was tight, the words trapped behind a wall of disbelief. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was all she could manage. He seemed to understand. He nodded back, then turned and walked out the front door, leaving her alone in the quiet house with her son, the contract, and a choice she never thought she would have again. The first days passed in a careful, silent choreography. Elias moved through his routines with the same deliberate pace as always, yet everything was different. The house was no longer empty. There was a new center of gravity, a quiet presence that pulled at the edges of his solitude. He was acutely aware of Lena, of the soft rustle of her movements in the other room, the faint, sweet smell of milk and sleeping baby that now clung to the air. He found himself listening for the sound of Leo's waking cry or the murmur of Lena's voice as she soothed him. He had given her space, taking his meals on the porch and spending his days from sunup to sundown in the fields, mending fences that didn't need mending. He was scanning his own territory for threats, he realized, but the threat was not external. It was the hope, fragile and unfamiliar, that she might choose to stay. He started leaving things for her. A pail of fresh milk on the counter in the morning. A basket of vegetables from his garden on the kitchen table. He never said they were for her. He just left them, offerings to a skittish doe. One evening he came in from the barn to find her by the dying light of the window, mending a tear in Leo's thin blanket. Her own dress was frayed, the stitches and the seams giving way. Her needle was small and bent, the thread a pale, weak thing. She didn't look up as he entered, but he felt her awareness of him, a subtle tensing in her shoulders. The next morning, before he left for the fields, he placed a small, unopened sewing kit on the table beside the vegetable basket. It contained spools of strong, dark thread, a packet of new needles, and a silver thimble he'd found in his mother's long-forgotten things. It felt like a confession. He watched her from a distance, learning her habits. She drank her tea pail, so he began to pour the hot water into her cup first, letting his own bag steep longer in the pot. He noticed she always took the smaller portion of bread at supper, so he started cutting the slices thicker and placing the largest one on her plate before he took his own. These were small, silent acts of service, the only language he knew for the things building inside him. His protection was evolving. It was no longer about a piece of paper or a man like Croft. It was about the chill in the evening air that might bother the baby, or the splintered wood on the porch step she might catch her skirt on. He planed it smooth. He fixed the squeak in her bedroom door. He was mending his home, not for himself, but for them. And in doing so, he felt the first tentative stitches beginning to mend the silent, hollow space inside his own chest. Lena watched him. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes as they shared the silent space of the kitchen. She watched him as he moved about his chores, his competence a quiet, reassuring presence. She had spent a lifetime learning to read men, to anticipate their moods, their desires, their tempers. But Elias Thorne was a language she didn't know. He spoke in gestures, in offerings left on a table, without expectation of thanks. He spoke in the way he gave her the warmest side of the hearth. In the fuller cup of milk he always poured for her. In the way his eyes would find Leo and soften with a gentleness that seemed wholly at odds with his rugged exterior. She did not trust it at first. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. She tested him. She established her lines and watched to see if he would cross them. "I will tend to the boy," she said, her voice sharp. When he moved to retrieve a wooden block Leo had dropped, he simply stopped, nodded, and stepped back. "Of course," he'd said. He deferred to her in all things concerning the child, and in all things concerning herself. He never entered her room without knocking, never stood too close, never let his gaze linger. His respect was a constant, steady thing, as reliable as the sunrise. It was this consistency that began to slowly, carefully, dismantle her defenses. One evening, He came in from the west pasture later than usual. A sleeve on his work shirt was torn, a long, ragged gash from elbow to wrist where it had caught on barbed wire. A shallow scratch, red and angry, marked his forearm. He went to the basin to wash, his movements stiff with exhaustion. Lena found herself speaking before she'd made a conscious decision, too. "I can mend that for you." He stilled, his back to her. He seemed to consider it for a moment. Then he nodded, unbuttoning the shirt and shrugging it off. The sight of his bare back, the broad, corded muscles, the sun-darkened skin, was startlingly intimate. It was an act of profound trust to make himself vulnerable like that. She took the shirt, her fingers brushing the warm cotton. She sat at the table, the sewing kit he'd given her open beside her. The needle felt solid and sure in her hand, the thread strong. She worked by the light of the oil lamp, her stitches small and neat. The house was so quiet, she could hear the soft hiss of the lamp and the sound of his breathing. When she was finished, the scene was a tidy raised line against the faded fabric. She held it out to him. He took it, and for a half-second, his fingers closed over hers. A jolt, warm and startling, shot up her arm. It wasn't a spark of passion, but a current of pure, unadorned connection. He pulled the shirt on. "Thank you, Lena," he said, his voice a low burr. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded less like a name and more like a prayer in the lamplit silence of the room. The rain began in the late afternoon, a soft drumming that grew steadily into a relentless torrent. It lashed against the windows and found its way through the smallest cracks in the old house. Elias sat at the kitchen table, oiling a piece of leather harness, the familiar task of comfort against the storm's fury. He could hear Lena moving in her room, her soft footsteps a counter-rhythm to the rain. Then he heard another sound, a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. He stopped his work, listening. It was coming from her room. The old leak in the east wing roof, the one he'd meant to fix before the summer ended. A curse escaped him under his breath. He rose and went to her door, knocking softly. "Lena?" She opened it a crack, her face pale in the gloom. Leo was fussing in her arms, his sleep disturbed by the incessant dripping. A small puddle was already forming on the floorboards near her bed. "The roof," he said, stating the obvious. He saw the worry in her eyes, the exhaustion. "My room is dry," he offered, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. "The bed is large enough. You and the boy can take it. I'll sleep on the floor, by the fire." He expected her to refuse, to retreat behind the walls of her pride. Instead, she looked at him, her gaze searching his face in the dim light. She seemed to find what she was looking for. "You will not sleep on the floor," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The floor is cold. We can share." The invitation hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. It was her choice, her offering. A wave of something fierce and protective washed over him. He nodded, unable to speak. He fetched his own pillow and a spare blanket. In his room, she laid the sleeping baby in the center of the large bed, creating a small, warm barrier. She settled on the far side, leaving a vast territory of mattress between them. Elias hesitated, then lay down on the very edge of his side, his body rigid. He was intensely aware of her, of the heat her body gave off, of the scent of rain and clean linen that clung to her. He could hear her breathing, a soft, even sound in the darkness. The storm raged outside, but inside the room, a profound stillness had fallen. He lay there for a long time, listening to the rain and her breath, feeling the shared warmth seep into the cold, empty spaces of the bed. He was a guardian, a protector. Tonight, that meant simply being a warm, solid presence in the dark. He turned his head slightly on the pillow. "I will keep you warm," he whispered, a vow made not just to her, but to the fragile new life taking root in the heart of his quiet home. Weeks turned into a season. The relentless summer heat gave way to the soft, golden light of autumn. A comfortable rhythm settled over the house, a domesticity so natural it felt as if it had always been this way. Elias found himself watching for Lena's smile, a rare, unguarded thing that lit her face from within when Leo did something new, like grasp a wooden spoon in his chubby fist. He spent evenings at the kitchen table, a warm primer from his own childhood open between them, pointing out the letters. "Ah," he would say, his voice low. "B," she learned quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth. He found these moments of shared, quiet purpose more intimate than any touch. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with a low hum of shared existence. Then, one crisp afternoon, a horseman appeared on the ridge. Elias saw him from the barn, his hand instinctively going to the axe handle leaning against the wall. His heart hardened into a cold knot. It was Silas Croft. Lena was on the porch, rocking Leo in her arms, humming a soft tune. She saw him too, and the song died on her lips. She stood, her body becoming a shield for her son once more. Elias walked out to meet him, planting his feet in the dusty yard, a living wall between Croft and his house. Croft dismounted, his smile a greasy smear on his face. "Thorne," he said, his eyes flicking past Elias to Lena on the porch. "I've come for what's mine. That paper you bought was for her labor, not her person. The transfer wasn't fully legal without the magistrate's stamp. She owes me." He spoke as if Lena weren't there, as if she were a stray cow he'd come to reclaim. He took a step toward the porch. "Come on, girl. You've had your little holiday." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply shifted his weight, his presence becoming an immovable object. "She is not yours," he said, the words flat and cold as river stones. "This is her home now. Is that so?" Croft sneered. "We'll see what the law has to say about that. A contract is a contract." He looked at Lena again, his gaze lingering in a way that made Elias's hands clench into fists. "I'll be back. With the sheriff. You can't hide behind this farmer forever." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a thick, poisonous silence in his wake. Lena hadn't moved from the porch, but Elias could see the tremor in her hands. He walked to the steps and looked up at her, seeing the old fear, the one he thought he'd banished, back in her eyes. "He will not take you," Elias said. It was not a reassurance. It was a vow. That night, the quiet in the house was different. It was taut, a string stretched to its breaking point. They moved through the evening chores, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. After Leo was asleep, they sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a small circle of golden light in the encroaching darkness. The indenture contract, which Lena had tucked away on the mantelpiece, seemed to mock them from the shadows. Elias could no longer bear the silence. He had to give her more than just his physical protection. He had to give her his truth. "He can't make you go," he began, his voice rough. Lena looked down at her hands, folded tightly on the table. "The law is on his side, Elias. A piece of paper is more powerful than a good man's word." He saw the despair in her posture, and it broke something open in him. "Then the law is wrong," he said, his voice raw with a conviction that surprised him. "This house, I built it for a family. My wife Sarah and our 2 boys. We were only here a year before the fever took them." The confession left him hollowed out, the old grief a physical ache in his chest. He hadn't spoken their names aloud in years. "I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. This house was all I had left of them. It was a tomb, until you came." He finally looked at her and saw tears shimmering in her eyes, not of pity, but of a deep, shared understanding. "I was a widow," she whispered, her own story tumbling out into the safe space he had created. My husband died in a mill accident. Croft held the debt on our small plot of land. He gave me a choice: sign the indenture, or he would take my home and see me and my son out on the street. It was never a choice at all. They sat in the charged silence. Their pasts lay bare on the table between them. Their separate griefs, their individual survivals, had converged into a single shared story. Elias stood and walked to the fireplace. He took the crumpled contract from the mantel. It felt flimsy in his hand, a worthless scrap. He held it out to her. "This paper has no power here," he said softly. "It is your story. You decide how it ends." Lena rose and came to him. Her hand was steady as she took the document from him. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the cast-iron stove, lifted the grate, and fed the paper to the hungry flames. They stood together, side by side, and watched it curl into black ash, the last vestiges of her bondage turning into smoke and disappearing up the chimney. In its place, a partnership was forged. 2 days later, they came. The sheriff, a man named Miller, whose face was etched with the weary duty of his office, rode alongside Silas Croft. Elias saw them from the window, a knot tightening in his stomach. He turned to Lena, who was standing by the hearth, her expression calm and resolute. He didn't tell her what to do, what to say. He simply met her eyes, a silent communication passing between them. "I am with you." He opened the door before they could knock. He stood on the porch, not blocking the way, but holding his ground. "Sheriff," he said, his nod respectful. "Croft." His tone was ice. Croft smirked from his saddle. "Told you I'd be back, Thorne. Now step aside." Sheriff Miller dismounted, his gaze moving from Elias to the open doorway, where Lena now stood. She held Lio in her arms, not as a shield, but as a statement. This is who she was, a mother. "Ma'am," Miller began, his voice gravelly but not unkind, "Mr. Croft here has filed a legal claim. He says you're bound to him by an indenture contract. Says you've absconded." Elias felt a surge of rage, but he held it in check. This was not his fight to win with fists. He stood beside Lena, a half step behind her, his presence a silent declaration of support. He was her anchor, but this was her voice defined. He watched her, waiting. He would follow her lead, no matter where it went. He saw her take a breath, her spine straightening. The moment was hers. Lena looked past the sheriff, past the smug, proprietary glare of Silas Croft, and met Elias's eyes. In their quiet depths, she saw not a command or a plan, but a simple, unwavering trust in her. He was giving her the floor. He was giving her the choice. It was the greatest gift he could have offered. She drew strength from it, from the solid warmth of his presence beside her. She turned her clear, steady gaze to the sheriff. "I belong to no man, Sheriff Miller," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was the voice of a woman who had been to the bottom and had clawed her way back. "I was coerced into signing that paper. But it was burned. It is ash. I am a guest in Mr. Thorne's home. By his invitation." She paused, letting the words settle in the dusty air. Then she took one small step forward, closing the fractional space between herself and Elias, her shoulder brushing his arm. It was a public declaration, a claiming. "And I have chosen to stay," she finished, her gaze locking with Elias's. "We are building a life here." The words, simple and plain, were the most profound vow she had ever made. They were a promise not just to him, but to herself. The sheriff looked from her determined face to Croft's sputtering indignation and to Elias's stoic calm. He was a man who understood the difference between the letter of the law and the heart of justice. He sighed, a weary sound. "A contract requires consent, Croft," he said, his tone final. "And it seems to me this woman has made her choice clear. This is a domestic matter now, not a legal one." He tipped his hat to Lena. "Ma'am." Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving Croft standing alone in the yard, his power turned to dust. The departure of the sheriff and a fuming Silas Croft left a vacuum in their wake. The confrontation had been quiet, bloodless, but the adrenaline of it still thrummed under Lena's skin, leaving a fine tremor in her hands. She looked down and saw that she had clenched her fists so tightly her nails had bitten into her palms, leaving 4 pale crescents on each. One had broken the skin, a tiny, perfect bead of red. Elias noticed. He didn't say a word about Croft or the sheriff, or the victory they had just quietly won. He simply saw her, the aftermath of her courage. He turned and went to the water pump, the rhythmic squeak and splash a comforting, ordinary sound. He returned with a small basin of warm water and a clean linen cloth. He stood before her, his gaze gentle. "May I?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She unfurled her fingers, offering her hand to him. He took it, his large, calloused thumb stroking over her knuckles, before he dipped the cloth into the water. He washed the small cut with an impossible tenderness, his touch careful and sure. He was not just cleaning a wound. He was tending to her, offering a quiet, physical comfort that said everything his words could not. He was washing away the last remnants of the fight, of the fear, of the man who had tried to own her. The simple act of aftercare was more profound, more intimate than any declaration. It was a promise of safety made tangible, a vow of partnership written in the language of gentle hands and warm water. When he was done, he held her hand for a moment longer, his warmth seeping into her, steadying her. He had protected her not with violence, but with his unyielding presence. And now he was healing her with his care. That evening, the house felt truly theirs for the first time. The peace was not the fragile quiet of 2 strangers coexisting, but the deep, settled calm of a shared home. After their meal, Elias sat at the table methodically cleaning his rifle. It was a ritual Lena had seen him perform a dozen times, a part of his orderly routine. But tonight, when he finished, he did something different. He slid the rifle back onto its pegs above the mantelpiece, but he placed it with the wooden stock facing the room, the hilt end turned toward her. It was a subtle shift, a reorientation. The weapon was no longer positioned for his hand alone. It was placed in trust, a shared defense of their home. It was his way of saying, "What is mine is yours to protect us." Later, she sat practicing her letters, the primer open before her. Elias had been teaching her to write her own name, and in her focus, she pressed too hard on the nib of the pen, sending a small blot of black ink across her fingers. A sound of frustration escaped her. Elias rose from his chair by the fire. He came to the table, took her hand in his, and examined the ink stains as if they were a serious injury. He led her to the wash basin, and with a small piece of lye soap, carefully worked the ink from her skin, his thumb moving in slow, gentle circles against her palm. The sensation was electric, a micro-intimacy that sent a shiver through her. At supper, they ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the crackle of the fire. Midway through the meal, Elias looked at her plate, then his own. He speared a piece of perfectly roasted potato, its skin crisp and salted, from his own dish and, without a word, held the fork out to her. It was a simple domestic gesture, an offering from his plate to hers. Lena leaned forward and accepted it. It tasted of the earth, of the fire, and of the quiet, burgeoning love that was filling every corner of their home. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the air scrubbed clean by the autumn chill. Elias found Lena in the yard, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Leo was a peaceful bundle in her arms. The land before them, his land, rolled out in gentle waves of brown and amber. He had worked this land alone for so long, wrestled a life from it with his own 2 hands. Now, seeing her there, she and the boy, It felt different. It didn't feel like his land anymore. It felt like theirs. He came to stand beside her, the warmth of his body, a comforting presence in the cool air. He had something in his hand, something he had been working on in the barn during the quiet hours after she and the boy were asleep. He opened his palm. Resting there was a small bird, carved from a piece of smooth, pale pine. Its wings were slightly upturned, as if ready for flight, and he had sanded it so carefully that it felt like a warm stone to the touch. He held it out to her. "For the boy," he said, his voice a little rough. He cleared his throat and added, the words quiet but firm with conviction, "For our boy." She took it, her fingers brushing his. The warmth of the wood was second only to the warmth of his skin. She looked from the perfect little bird to his face, and a smile bloomed, slow and radiant and completely unguarded. It was the first time he had seen all of her defenses fall away, and the sight of it stole his breath. "Elias," she said, and the way she spoke his name was a quiet claiming, a soft assertion of ownership that made his heart ache. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small, worn token, a simple flat button of polished pewter, saved from his mother's favorite coat. He pressed it into her free hand, closing her fingers around it. "A home needs a foundation," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. "This is ours." She curled her fingers tightly around the button, her eyes shining. They stood together a silent trinity in the dawn, and watched the sun claim the land that was now their future. A family forged not by law or by blood, but by careful consent, quiet vows, and a love that had at last found its home.